She was once one of the most recognizable child stars on television, loved by millions every week. But behind the bright screen and the perfect image, something much darker was unfolding in the background. As the fame faded, the life she built inside Hollywood began to fall apart in ways few people ever saw coming. What really happened after the camera stopped rolling has left many still asking questions today. Join us as we uncover the untold story behind the rise and tragic fall of Family Affair. Star Anissa Jones. Mary Anissa Jones was born in 1958 in West Lafayette, Indiana, into a family that on the surface looked stable and promising. Her father, John Paul Jones, worked as a NASA engineer, a job that placed him in a highly respected and demanding field during a time when space exploration was a major national focus. Her mother, Mary Paula Jones, stayed closely involved in family life. From the beginning, Anissa grew up in a home where intelligence, discipline, and achievement were valued very highly. Not long after her birth, the family moved to California because of her father's work. This move turned out to be important for what would later happen in Anissa's life. California in the 1960s was not only growing fast but also becoming a central place for television, advertising, and film production. As a child, Anissa was described as lively, expressive, and very comfortable in social settings. She had a natural energy that made her stand out. People around her often noticed that she seemed aware of cameras and attention even at a young age. These early traits would later become important when casting directors began looking for child actors with natural, unforced behavior. Inside her home, there was also a strong emphasis on doing well. Academic performance, manners, and behavior were all closely guided. While this structure helped provide stability, it also placed pressure on children to meet high standards from an early age. For Anissa, this meant growing up with the idea that success and approval were tied closely to performance. At the same time, there were quieter signs that the family environment was not completely simple. Like many households under stress from work, demands, and daily responsibilities, there were periods of emotional distance and tension between parents. These moments still shaped the emotional atmosphere in which Anissa was raised. As the family settled into California life, Anissa's entry into modeling and small commercial work began at a young age. Her natural appearance and expressive personality made her a good fit for print ads and early television commercials. These small jobs were often presented as harmless or even fun opportunities, and they introduced her to professional sets, photographers, and casting routines before she reached her teenage years. In 1966, everything changed for Anissa Jones when she auditioned for the CBS sitcom Family Affair. The show was being developed as a family-friendly comedy built around an unusual setup: a bachelor suddenly becoming responsible for 3 orphaned children. One of those children was Buffy, a young girl who needed to feel believable, warm, and emotionally real on screen. Casting directors knew this role had to work perfectly because the success of the entire show depended on the children feeling authentic to viewers. The audition process was competitive, with many child actors from across Los Angeles brought in to read. Anissa stood out during this process for reasons that were not just about appearance. She had a natural way of expressing emotion that did not feel rehearsed. When she delivered her lines, she seemed calm, clear, and believable without forcing anything. Casting directors often look for children who do not appear to be acting, and Anissa had that quality. Her expressions felt real, and her timing matched the tone the producers wanted for Buffy. Her look also fit what television networks of that era considered ideal: a clean, simple, all-American appearance that matched the image CBS wanted for a wholesome family show. Once she was selected, approval came quickly. The network and producers did not hesitate for long after seeing her performance. When Anissa was chosen, it marked the beginning of a rapid transition from everyday child life to national television visibility. After landing the role, her life changed almost immediately. She moved into a professional routine that included regular filming schedules, script readings, costume fittings, and publicity sessions. The structure of her contract reflected industry standards of that time, which did not offer the same level of protection for child actors that exists today. Filming for Family Affair took place on a weekly schedule, and this consistency meant that Anissa's time quickly became organized around the studio. Long hours on set became normal, and her availability was often dictated by production demands. Even though she was still a child, She was now part of a professional system that required discipline and repetition. One of the biggest changes in her life was the loss of a normal school and social environment. Instead of spending full days in a classroom with other children, her education was adjusted around filming. Tutoring or on-set schooling replaced regular attendance, and her interactions with peers outside the industry became limited. Most of her daily time was spent with adults working in television production, rather than with children her own age. Once Anissa became part of Family Affair, her identity on screen quickly became larger than her real life. She was cast as Buffy, one of 3 orphan children taken in by a wealthy bachelor. The character was designed to fit a very specific idea that television audiences of the 1960s expected a well-behaved, loving, and emotionally gentle child who could bring warmth into every scene. Buffy was written as the perfect orphan child, someone who could show innocence without conflict and affection without resistance. The writers shaped Buffy carefully to fit this image. Her lines were simple and direct, and her reactions were often emotionally idealized. This made Buffy easy for audiences to accept and admire, but it also meant that Anissa had to perform a version of childhood that was tightly controlled and emotionally limited. To match this character, Anissa's appearance was also carefully maintained. Her clothing was selected to reflect a neat, traditional image of a young girl from a stable home. Her hairstyle was always kept tidy, often styled in a way that became instantly recognizable to viewers. Over time, these visual choices became part of her identity in the public eye. She was not just Anissa Jones anymore. She was Buffy, the TV daughter that audiences saw every week. As the show gained popularity, the line between Anissa and Buffy began to blur. Many viewers did not separate the actress from the character. To them, she was Buffy in real life as well. This kind of public perception placed a heavy burden on her because it meant she was constantly associated with a fictional identity that she had to maintain even outside of filming. On set, there were expectations about behavior that went beyond acting. She was expected to remain calm, polite, and consistent with the image of Buffy at all times. Even during breaks, her behavior was often guided by adults who worked on the show. Public appearances, interviews, and photo sessions were also carefully managed. She was presented in a controlled way with limited freedom to express herself outside of what fit the show's image. Interviews were often supervised, and her responses were kept simple and appropriate for her character's image. This created a situation where even public communication reinforced the idea that she was the same person as the character she played. Over time, small signs of discomfort began to appear. Being always Buffy meant there was little room for her to develop a separate identity in the eyes of others. Even when she was not filming, people treated her as the character. This created a quiet but growing sense of frustration, as the boundaries between her real self and her television role became harder to maintain. She was still a child, but her life was already shaped by a public image that did not leave much space for change or personal growth. In 1971, Family Affair was cancelled. For Anissa Jones, that moment marked a sudden and major break in her life. The show had been her daily structure for years. It set her schedule, defined her identity in public, and gave her a clear sense of purpose. When it ended, that entire system disappeared almost overnight. The cancellation did not come with a gradual transition. One day she was working regularly on a hit television series, and the next she was no longer needed on set. For a child who had spent most of her formative years inside that environment, the change was abrupt and difficult to adjust to. Unlike adult actors, child stars in that era were rarely given structured support for what came after a show ended. There were no clear programs in place to help them shift into teenage roles or prepare them for a different kind of acting career. Once the show stopped, they were expected to simply move on and find new opportunities on their own. Anissa and her representatives made attempts to continue her acting career, but the transition was not smooth. The entertainment industry had limited space for former child stars entering adolescence. Casting directors often preferred either younger children or fully established teen actors who had not been strongly associated with one long-running character. The role of Buffy had been so recognizable that it made it hard for the industry to see her in a different way. This type of typecasting was common for child actors, and often limited their future opportunities. The psychological impact of this sudden change was significant. Going from being regularly seen and recognized to becoming mostly unknown in a short period can be difficult for anyone, especially a young person who had grown up in that environment. The sense of being discarded by the industry was something many former child actors have described, and Anissa was no exception. Without the structure of filming and professional routines, her daily life also changed. She began spending more time outside of Hollywood circles, where the support systems she once had were no longer present. After Family Affair ended and the attention faded, Anissa entered a very different stage of life. One of the first major changes was returning to regular schooling. Instead of on-set tutoring and structured filming days, she was now placed in a traditional school environment with other teenagers. This adjustment was not easy. She had spent most of her childhood in a controlled, adult-centered environment, so everyday school life felt different and sometimes overwhelming. Social dynamics among teenagers can already be challenging, and for someone who had been widely recognized on television, it added another layer of difficulty. At home, tensions also began to increase. As she grew older, she became more independent and less willing to follow strict guidance from her parents. This is a common part of adolescence, but in her case, it was intensified by her unusual upbringing. She had spent years under adult control in a professional setting, and now she was trying to figure out who she was outside of that system. During the early 1970s, California was also going through a major cultural shift. Many young people were experimenting with new lifestyles, music scenes, and social groups. Unfortunately, this environment also included widespread drug use, and Anissa was exposed to it through friends and social circles outside of her earlier Hollywood connections. She also made attempts to step away from her Buffy identity. Being known primarily as a former child star made it difficult for her to be seen as just a regular teenager. In response, she tried to build a new sense of self that was separate from her television past. However, reports from people around her suggested that her behavior became increasingly unpredictable over time. There were moments of emotional instability, shifting moods, and difficulty maintaining consistent routines. The combination of lost structure, changing social environments, and personal pressure made stability harder to maintain. In the final months of Anissa Jones's life, her situation became increasingly unstable. She was no longer connected to the structured world she had grown up in during Family Affair, and her day-to-day life lacked consistency. Reports describe a period marked by frequent changes in living arrangements where she did not have a steady or secure home environment. During this time, her struggles with substance use also became more serious. What may have started earlier as experimentation developed into deeper patterns of dependency. Substances such as alcohol and prescription drugs, including barbiturates, became part of her life in ways that increased risk and reduced her ability to cope with emotional stress. As her personal life became more chaotic, she also began to withdraw from family members and people who had known her earlier in life. Communication became less frequent, and emotional distance grew wider. For someone who had once been part of a tightly managed and public career, this isolation marked a major shift in her support system. There were also signs that she was struggling emotionally. People who knew her during this period described moments that suggested depression and self-destructive behavior. In 1976, at just 18 years old, Anissa Jones died. Her death was ruled as mixed drug intoxication involving barbiturates and alcohol. This combination is known to be particularly dangerous, as it can severely depress the central nervous system. Her passing occurred in a private setting away from public view, marking a quiet and tragic end to a life that had once been widely recognized on television. In the decades since, Anissa's story has become a cautionary tale. In 2025, as California lawmakers revisited child actor protection laws following the Quiet on Set documentary, her name was mentioned during legislative hearings as an example of why stronger oversight is needed. Advocates pointed out that while financial protections have improved, emotional and psychological support systems for former child stars remain inadequate. Anissa Jones was never given the tools to build a life after Buffy. And for that, the industry that made her famous must still answer.